Evening, everybody. Welcome to this Early Years Inspectorate webinar. The topic of the webinar this evening is Early Years Service Re-registration. My name is Grant Land and I'm the Regulatory Practice Development Manager, and I'm going to facilitate this evening as we go through. And I'm going to hand you over now to Mike Corcoran, who is Head of Registration and Enforcement, to introduce the webinar. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you very much. And as Grant said, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. We're delighted to see you all. And this is the second webinar that we've done this year in relation to the completion of the 2019 registration submissions. And that is the topic that we're covering this evening. So for those of you who might be interested in either school age registrations or re-registration for services registered after 2019, there is information on our website that would help you kind of in relation to that. But for this evening's webinar, we're focusing just purely on the submissions kind of from the 2019 process. So you will all be aware by now that we have set a deadline in relation to the closure of this kind of process. Our deadline that is set for that is the 1st of November, and that was agreed in conjunction with the Department of the Children in relation to this kind of process. And the main reason that we're putting a kind of closure date on this is that any service that really is registering in 2019 or was re-registered in 2019 will have to register again at the end of next year and in 2022. So we were anxious not to have the two processes, for obvious reasons, kind of running into each other. What we're going to cover this evening really is somewhat of a recap, I think, in relation to some of the information that we would have shared with you, or those of you that were with us in March. And for those who are new and joining us for the first time, we just want to set out kind of very clearly for you really what is the information that is required to be submitted. Thank you for bearing with us and your patience, because I mean, in the last number of months we've had the most challenging of times for us in that we lost all kind of connection to our IT systems and our IT connectivity, which meant that our ability to respond to emails, our ability to respond to queries has been significantly hampered in light of that. And huge credit and has to go and praise to Jane and her team for managing to kind of keep some communications open and to continue to process applications for both school age and kind of for re-registration. But we haven't focused on re-registration submissions in recent weeks because we have a more pressing deadline in relation to the closure of school age kind of registration service applications and services requiring that process to be completed. So we've had, as a result of the cyber attack, we've had to kind of re-divert our resources into getting that process kind of in hand and closed out. With a view then that we would divert all of our resources then towards the re-registration process as we got closer to kind of November. So if there's any of you there been a bit frustrated with this, I apologize. I completely understand that you would be, but we've really struggled in the aftermath of the cyber attack to be able to put together kind of interim structures and interim kind of communication systems. And thankfully our systems are pretty much mostly back online now, and we'll be able to kind of respond in full as we kind of go. So that's me. I think I'll be speaking during the presentation later on, just in relation to some of the requirements. But for now, I'm going to hand you back to my colleague Jane, who will introduce herself and her aspects of the presentation that she's going to speak to this evening. And to you, Jane.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Mike. Good evening, everybody. Jane Hayes is my name. I'm the registration manager. My responsibilities are the registration of new services that wish to open and register with us, the registration of the school age services, change in circumstances process, and cessations, managing cessations. So anything that comes in under that falls within my remit. And the re-registration, most certainly. So we currently have re-registration ongoing on a yearly basis because every service has to re-register every 3 years. But we still have to close out, as Mike had said, on the 2019 re-registration submissions. So that's what we're hoping to do, and that's the purpose of our meeting here this evening, is just to bring some further clarity in relation to that. Just to give a recap in relation to the documentation requirements, and just to, I suppose, inform you of where things are at. So I will start by looking at the legislation around re-registration, and that legislation stems from the Child and Family Agency Act of 2013. And Article 58D4 of that Act requires that the period of registration shall be 3 years from the date of registration. Therefore, I suppose all of the services that registered with us initially in 2016, which was our first registration period, registered through a statutory declaration form process. So that was paper-based exercise. It was a very straightforward process to bring everybody into registration. Following on from that, then we had to progress to the 2019. The 3-year cycle was up, and in 2019 we were progressing through the full registration process. That process, as you know, was divided into 2 parts. In order to provide assistance to yourselves to complete the registration and to meet the requirements within the registration process. So the first part of that was completed in December of 2019. All services were re-registered, were placed back on the register, and would have got a letter of registration at that time. Part B, or the second phase of that registration then, that was pushed out to June of 2020 initially. But as you're all aware now, due to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, the deadline for that was extended to 2021, with, as Mike said, in consultation with the department, a timeframe of the 1st of November set for the completion of that process. So back in 2020, the portal was reopened to all applicants in order to complete the applications that were there. At that time, the assessment team had looked at all of the applications available, had looked at the documents submitted, and carried out a pretty thorough assessment in order to be able to go back to each specific service and identify the documents that were outstanding in order to complete the registration. That information in relation to the outstanding documentation was sent out on the portal. So when I say it's sent out on the portal, each applicant gets an email with the details of what's on the portal, of that message on the portal. So that information should be within the email inbox of yourselves. But if you can't find it as an email within your inbox, if you log back into your portal application, you should see the details of the message within the portal application itself. So going back to that time, when we did our complete assessment of the applications, we found that 94% of the applications were still incomplete. So 94% had additional documents to submit for the second part of the registration process. So there were about 2,447 services, and in the interim period, there's been about 4% of services which have ceased operation. In March of 2021, that completion rate had risen to 35%. So currently we have 35% of services who have completed the re-registration process, and of the ones that are still remaining, 52% have submitted the fire safety documentation to date on the portal application, with 55% having submitted the planning and the building suitability. And I suppose the reason I bring those to attention is because these, we know, are the documents that can and have caused delays for services in order to attain the documentation, or to submit the documentation, or to get those in order. So over half are in relation to that, which also leads us to know that there are services there who have maybe just the policies to submit, or who have maybe just the floor plans to submit in order to complete the application process. That's something that is easily achievable because they are documents that you would have on file in the service anyway. Grant, if you could please move the slide to the next slide. So just for further breakdown in relation to the re-registration status, 23% of applications have outstanding vetting documentation. Now, the vetting documentation is in relation to Board of Management or directors who may have access to children in the service. The vetting documentation for registered providers, yourselves, was already submitted prior to December 2019, so that has been dealt with. What is outstanding from services is confirmation that the board members or directors don't have access to children in the service and therefore vetting not required, or confirmation that there are no directors or board members for the service, or in the instances where you have board members, that vetting is submitted on the portal. 26% have not submitted policies, and we do know that the 5 policies that are required as part of the re-registration process are in existence in all services. So we would hope to be able to get those policies in quite readily. 1,100 services have made no contact with the registration office since the first submission in 2019. So that's quite a sizable amount of services that would have received the email or the message on the portal. So it's something, I suppose, that needs to be revisited to look and see and familiarise yourself as to the status of the application and to the exact documents that still remain outstanding within it. Thanks, Grant. So just to recap in relation to the documents that are required, the fire safety documentation and compliance statements, planning and building suitability documentation. So Mike will go into those in more detail now quite shortly. Garda vetting for the directors and board members who have access to children as part of their duties, and I have discussed that already. The policies, the 5 policies, and the indoor floor plans or the outdoor layout as such. The indoor floor plans are the measurements of the space that's really available to the children for their work, play and movement in all areas within the service, and the location of the specific rooms of the service. In the outdoor area, we don't need measurements for the outdoor area, but what we do need is to see where the outdoor area is located in relation to the premises itself and the perimeter of the outdoor area and the access to it. Thanks, Grant. So the 5 policies then that remain outstanding, and as I said, these policies are available in all services currently, are the complaints policy, infection control policy, safe sleep policy, behaviour management, and administration of medication. These can be uploaded as a complete document, maybe all of them within one document or as individual documents. What we would ask is that they're not uploaded page by page onto the portal. It'll take very long for yourselves to upload them and for the assessment team to assess them. The safe sleep policy we are requesting in relation to sessional services, and within the safe sleep policy for sessional services we need detail in relation to the facilities provided should a child need a rest while they're attending the service, or should a child need a sleep while they're attending the service, and including the supervision for those children while they sleep. But all other policies are, very much in use within each individual service. So it's a case of going back into the portal, having a look at the information that's there and seeing, am I the service that just still has policies to submit, and they can be uploaded onto the portal to complete out this part of the re-registration process. I'll come back shortly in relation to the details of accessing the portal and managing the portal application. And for now, I'll hand you over to Mike, who will go into further detail in relation to the fire and planning requirements. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane. And good evening again, everybody. I'm going to talk, as Jane said, about the fire safety documentation and building suitability documentation, which, kind of in layman's terms is kind of, the areas of planning permission and building control. So I'll just start with fire safety documentation. So there are two different types of documentation that we will accept or that we look for. I'm going to start on the left-hand side of the slide there with the fire certification. So fire certificate or a fire safety certificate is a document that's required for services that have been operational kind of within the last kind of 5 years. And the fire and planning legislation sets out the statutory requirements to have a fire certificate in place. So if you fall into that category and you're supplying a fire safety certificate, what we also require is for you to supply us with either a completion certificate or confirmation from the supervising architect that the building has been built in and constructed in accordance with the fire certificate. Because the fire certificate application process with the local authorities currently is a process that is based on plans been submitted to the fire authority. So essentially, really, the fire authorities themselves carry out very few site inspections during an application process. So essentially, what the process is the plans have been submitted, and what the fire certificate will say that if it's built in accordance with these plans, then the fire certificate will be granted and is therefore valid. If it is not built in accordance with the plans, it is invalid. So therefore, we require confirmation that the certificate or the building has been built in accordance with a certificate. Also, in relation to fire certification, sometimes there are conditions attached by the local authority to the fire certificate. Those conditions might limit the numbers of children that are in the premises. It might stipulate or prescribe a type of building fabric that is to be used. It might prescribe the location of fire exits, etc., specifically to the building. So if there are conditions attached to the document, we will require a copy of those, and we will also require in the confirmation process or the completion process that those conditions have been complied with. For services who are using a fire risk assessment, so this essentially applies to services that are older than the last 5 years, they don't require a fire certificate for the most part. What they require is a fire risk assessment, and this is carried out by a competent person. And if you need any guidance in relation to this, if you go to the resources section of our website, there is a comprehensive kind of guide to fire and planning requirements kind of set out there. It's very similar. If a fire risk assessment has been kind of carried out, we would expect that any scheduled works would accompany that. If there's any works required, and lots of incidents, no works are required. But if we would, what we would look for, I suppose, is that anything that poses a risk to children or is deemed essential, that we would look for that to be carried out immediately. And then any other item, there is a 6-month period of grace to allow those to be carried out. Our focus is on the immediate risks that are identified then on the fire risk assessment. Grant, could I ask you to move on there, please, for me? Please. So some issues we've come across some issues with the fire safety documentation. So just to be clear, that the documents that we're looking for fire safety are the documents that are issued by the local authority under the building control and building regulations legislation, and not certificates of maintenance of fire extinguishers or alarm systems, or those that are installation systems. So we're not looking for those, although some of them say fire certificate on those. It is the ones by the local authority that we're looking for, and not those other documentation. The other thing that we also look for clarity on And this is particularly pertaining to kind of premises that might have started life as another type of premises, or, you know, kind of maybe in a primary school or something. What we're looking for is that the fire certification would identify that the premises is actually being used as a creche or a preschool setting. Sometimes we find that that's not clear, and that the fire authority or the fire documentation that we've gotten from the fire authority or supplied is either out of date and isn't reflective of a kind of a change of use. And what I should have said, that a fire certificate is also required where there has been a change of use of a building, or where there has been material alterations made to a building, you know, within the last kind of 5-year period. For those of you who have supplied us with a fire risk assessment, they must be accompanied, as I said earlier, by a schedule of works, and we will follow up with you in relation to the confirmation of the completion of those schedule of works before the November the 1st kind of deadline. Grant, can I ask you to move on there for me, please? So we often get kind of queries in relation to fire safety documentation, and people often ask us, well, you will often say to us things like, well, my landlord said I don't need a fire cert, or my architect said I don't need a fire cert. Really, only the local authority there, the legitimate authority in relation to making the determination if a fire cert is required, and where we have any doubt about it, what we would encourage you to do is talk to your local authority, and if documents come to us that we know don't acquiesce with decisions that are made by local authorities, we will check with them to double check if a fire cert is required. That happens very rarely, but there has been occasions when we've kind of had to do that. The other issue that can often show up is for those of you who are also providing a school age service alongside or kind of in the same premises as your preschool. We will also look for confirmation of the maximum numbers of children that can be accommodated at any one time in the service. And again, this is a rare issue. It does come up sometimes where there is a kind of a lack of clarity sometimes in relation to the numbers of children that should be there at the same time. And this can often present itself when we have preschool children leave the premises at a certain time and school-age children come in afterwards. And there can be sort of a kind of a combined number there, and we will often look to see what that combined number is to ensure that it kind of tallies with what the fire authorities are saying is safe for operations. And move on now to the area of kind of planning and building suitability documentation. So essentially, really, the documents that we look for here is essentially documents that are issued by the local authority under the planning and development legislation. And these are not lease agreements or proof of purchase documentation that might be signed by solicitors at the time of building, or at the time of kind of sale of premises. So these are essentially the document that sets out by the local authority saying that the building has been given proper permission, is located suitably, and is fit for purpose for use. So it's the planning documentation that we're looking for there. Similarly to the fire certification, if there's any conditions that have been applied to the planning permission, and those conditions can be anything from water supply to capping the numbers of children that can be placed in the service, to planning in relation to parking spaces or kind of hours of operation. Where those apply, we need to see a copy of those. And equally to the similar to the fire cert, and kind of with equal stature, is that we need kind of confirmation that the planning is clearly giving permission for the service to be used as a creche or a kind of a preschool. Now we do know, and many of you would be aware of the statute of limitations that's set out in planning legislation. So what that statute of limitations is. It says that where a service has been in operation for 7 or more years, that there is a statute ban on the local authority being able to take any planning enforcement against a service or an operator of a service who has been operating for 7 or more years. Now, there is some misnomers that exist in relation to that, and I just kind of advise you of those. The 7-year affidavit does not apply in a situation where the service has changed hands over the previous 7 years. So in other words, there is no accrual of that time it has to be the same provider for a period of 7 years. Secondly, which is also a misnomer we come across, is sometimes providers have been given planning permission from the outset with conditions to those planning permission, but for some reason or other, but that planning permission has not been complied with, or the conditions have not been adhered to. And we often get documentation saying that they're relying on an affidavit. Under the statute of limitations, the statute of limitations does not cover premises where planning was granted and where planning conditions were applied and not adhered to. That statute of limitations does not cover that scenario. That being said, we do know that some local authorities will not take any action in relation to that matter unless they get a complaint about it, and some local authorities do. So it's very difficult for us to advise, kind of area by area, but as a general rule, we would say where conditions have been applied that haven't been adhered to, or planning permission hasn't been adhered to, we would not advise you relying on an affidavit in that instance. And we have seen some examples of the local authorities taking action against kind of providers and operators of services for breach of planning legislation in those types of instances. So, not too many, and I don't want to alarm anybody in saying that, because it would not be correct to say that we've seen lots of examples of it, but we have seen some examples of it kind of over time. We can move on, Grant, please. So just kind of some of the, kind of the other issues really kind of that, that we have there that hopefully will assist people. Sometimes people run into difficulties where they have no option but to reapply for planning or apply for planning retention. Now, if that applies to any service provider who find themselves kind of having to do that, we will accept evidence of planning retention applications, and services will be allowed to continue operation under planning retention application. However, what we can't, I suppose, kind of be assured of or be sure of is that the planning authorities will indeed grant planning thereafter. So in the first instance, we will accept the planning retention applications and confirmation that an application has been made. But again, just be cautious that the planning authority may not, proceed to kind of grant it thereafter. If a planning condition has been applied to planning permission, we will require a confirmation that has been complied with, and an architect or a supervising architect or a visiting architect can provide you with that kind of confirmation, or a charter surveyor. The other kind of issues, kind of that before I hand you back to Jane, kind of in relation to this kind of whole area, there's been a lot of, I suppose, kind of commentary, that we hear back from, kind of TDs, and we hear back from other public representatives saying that these are all new requirements. These are not new requirements, and these are not TUSLA requirements. These are requirements that are set out by the Department of the Environment. And we've worked very closely with our colleagues in the Department of Environment and in the Department of within the Chief Fire Officers Association in relation to these areas. And so the provisions that we have set out here have been made in agreement with the Department of Environment and the Chief Fire Officers. And we're, we have brought in kind of into this equation, kind of options to allow kind of providers to be able to address the, fire and planning where they're outstanding. But in most instances, we're finding, in every new application and change of circumstances application that we've received since 2016, fire and planning has been addressed. And as Jane was saying earlier, so far, more than 50% of applications have fire and planning kind of addressed at this stage in the process, which is really good, and it provides a huge amount of assurance of safety to parents and to insurance companies and all the other vested interests that services are kind of safe and fit for operation. I'm going to hand you back over to Jane now, who will take you through some of the other issues that we're encountering, and I'll come back and speak to you later when we get to the questions time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Hello again, everybody. So I'll just go through maybe areas where delays might be caused, or where we have encountered issues in relation to the applications themselves. And some of those, I'm sorry now, I hope, is there feedback there in relation when I'm speaking, is there?
Yeah,
Is it
Mike,
clear?
I wonder if you could mute there, Mike.
Thank you very much. That's better, I think. Thank you. So, incomplete fire and planning documentation, and Mike has already covered quite a lot in relation to this, but if we find that the planning documentation references conditions attached and they haven't been submitted, we will be reverting back to yourselves and asking for those conditions to be submitted as part of the application. Similarly with the fire safety certificate, if there's conditions attached there, we'll go back for that. We very often have gone back to services in relation to clarity around the documents that were submitted. If it doesn't clearly state that the planning was provided for the purposes of offering an early years service or preschool service. Other delays that could be caused might be out-of-date Garda vetting documents, and as I said, the Garda vetting documents that we will be looking at in relation to this process are for the board members or directors who have access to children. Best practice would be that Garda vetting would be renewed every 3 years. And we would accept what is submitted if it's relatively recently in date, and we would ask that you go back to the Garda vetting unit and renew the Garda vetting and submit it when available. The using a mobile phone to photograph documents, this can cause problems from the point of view of the size of the documents then for uploading. It can cause delays with that. The quality can also be quite poor. When photographs are taken, we may not get the full page. It might not be clear enough to be able to read the document following on from that. Now, I see one of the questions that came in earlier was in relation to taking a photograph of the outdoor area. If it's a clear photograph that covers, the complete outdoor area and gives a very good indication of its location, its boundaries, and what is on offer there, that will absolutely be accepted. In relation to the floor plans don't need to be drafted by an architect. That's not necessary. What we do need are the measurements for that clear floor space, for the playrooms that are in use by children, for the space that the children use. Preferably those measurements to be in meters, square meters, but also that they would be an accurate measurement of the rooms provided. So a lot of the floor plans that we have accepted are very clear. They give a good indication of the layout of the service, of the location of all of the rooms within the service, and the measurements then for the clear floor space within the service. Other delays would be maybe, as Mike has covered already, the engagement with the local authorities in relation to planning and fire. If we have any concerns or if there are any issues in relation to the documents submitted, we will be asking you to revert back to your local authority to seek clarity in relation to the documentation submitted and to verify to us that it is provided for the purpose of operating the early year service. So those kind of things can cause delays. For the policies, it is preferable that the policies are submitted as part of a document and not page by page. Both for yourselves, it'll take quite a long time to upload individual pages onto the portal, and for the assessment team in order to be able to assess them. There is guidance on our website, the Guide to Developing Policies and Procedures for Early Years Services. There's very good sample policies available there that can be adapted to the type of service that you're providing yourselves and make it appropriate to what you want within your policy for the service. There's also additional policy guidance document for childminders, should you wish to avail of that as well. The labelling of documents I'll come to when we're looking at the uploading of documents onto the portal, but when you're saving those documents to your computer, your laptop, make sure to state exactly what the document is. If it's policy documents, if it's Garda vetting, and as they're attached and uploaded, then it'll be very apparent exactly what documents. It's very easy for yourselves then to go back and do a checklist and tick off and see that you have the relevant documents uploaded, and it'll be much quicker for the assessment of the application itself. As I said earlier, please check the spam or the junk mail accounts if you can't find the email that gave you the information back in May and June of last year as to the outstanding documentation, just in case any of our communication to you is going in to those folders instead. But if you can't find that email, that information will be on your portal application. It is important to submit all your documents on the portal. We can't accept the documents sent in via email or via post. They have to be part of the full application within the portal system, and this will also cause greater efficiencies when it comes to the re-registration next year as well, because all of that documentation will be in existence and will be on the portal application. Thank you, Grant. So in relation to logging back onto the portal, should you have any problems, we do have good portal support available. If you email portalsupport@tusla.ie, the team there are very happy to provide assistance with any technical problems that should arise. In order to access the portal, what you will need is the email address that you first set up the account with, and the telephone number that you used when setting up that account. When you log in with your email address, you will get a code to your phone, which you will have to input in order to access back into the account. So if your email address has changed in the meantime and you no longer have access to the old email address, contact Portal Support and they will be able to make those changes to the application in the background and allow you to re-access that application. If you have any other issues with the access to the portal itself, the Portal Support will help you. If your problems are in relation to the documents or any queries about the submissions, if you contact re.registration@tusla.ie, that email account is monitored to look after any queries in relation to the re-registration of services. Now, I did see earlier as well that there was a comment there about numerous attempts being made to contact us, and I would suggest, if you don't mind sending an email to re.registration@tusla.ie, and you can put it for the attention of myself and I'll follow up with you in relation to it. Somebody had put a message in there earlier. Thanks, Grant. So in relation, when you go back into your portal application, you will be able to click on My Submission. When you click on My Submission, you'll have two options. You'll be able to view your application or upload documents. So if you want to upload documents, you click on the upload button. It'll bring you to wherever you have your documents saved on your computer. You choose the document that you want to upload. That can sometimes be slow depending on the size of the document. So I would say just have a little bit of patience when it comes to that stage of it, because there can be some delays with it. Once you see that the document has uploaded, and you'll see it there on the screen in front of you, the next step will be document classification. That document classification is a drop-down menu. And within that drop-down menu is the option for every single document that's required as part of the registration process and re-registration process. So you can choose from that what document it relates to, and it's clicking on it and ticking it. If you have more than one document, or more than maybe you have the 5 policies together in one document, it'll give you the option to click on the 5 policies, and it'll show up as more than one document then at the outset. Once you have that done, I suppose the key thing is to click on the submit button. We have had a lot of queries back in from applicants who say, I've uploaded the documents and I've heard nothing back. And when we go back in and look at it, we realise that the submit button wasn't clicked, so it actually never came in to our side of the portal in order to assess it. So that's the process. There is guidance there in relation to the portal, in relation to the using of the portal. If you haven't been on it in a while, I would suggest that you go back and read the guidance to start with. There's quite a lot of guidance about the re-registration. On our website, on the TUSLA website, there's a specific button there for 2019 re-registration. If you click on that, the information is there in both Irish and English, and it'll bring you in then to additional information that's needed. If you run into any difficulty, by all means, send an email to re.registration@tusla.ie and a member of the team will be back to assist. If you know who was dealing with your application, and that will be stated on the response sent back out to you, you can contact that person directly as well. Now, that person may not still be dealing with your application because, as Mike said earlier, we have quite a sizable amount of work at the moment in relation to assessing the school age applications that have come into us and bringing those to completion. So a lot of the staff are working on those currently. We do have a lot of applications that have been resubmitted to us, and we're aware of that on the portal. We will get around to assessing those, and we will be back to each individual in relation to the documents that were submitted in relation to the application. So if you don't mind, if you could bear with us just for another while. If you have submitted your application and haven't heard back, we will be assessing them and we will be communicating directly with you in relation to it. Thanks, Grant. So the key messages from this evening's meeting here, I suppose, really is you know, that again, the deadline is the 1st of November to complete the applications. We would encourage people as much as possible to start looking at it now so that we're not waiting until the 1st of November to get all the applications in. So if at all possible, have a look and see what is outstanding and try and get the submissions in and the documents in prior to well in advance really of the 1st of November, if at all possible. The childcare committees are very much available to assist. We spoke with them this morning in relation to this. We went through all the requirements again with them, and they're more than happy to provide any assistance that you need. So do contact them within your local areas, and they will assist you if you run into any difficulties or if you need some help with it. This application must be completed. We will be moving on to re-registration, as Mike said, for next year. We have that on an ongoing basis. The services that registered in 2018 for the first time are re-registering this year. And likewise, the 2017 services all re-registered with us last year. And this, because you've gone through the main re-registration, we've been able to make it a more streamlined process because we have a lot of the documentation in already. Look at the checklist within the guidance document. I would say once you are uploading your documents, before you finish, just go down through the checklist. It's there in the guidance document, and do a cross-check and see, have you everything? Is it what it's supposed to be? And before you submit it, just make sure it's all in place. If you are unsure about any of your application or that, again, you know, the officers that would have sent out the communication to you last year will be available, and if they're not able to assist, they'll refer you on to whoever is currently dealing with your application. Thank you. Okay, so I suppose going back again, really, and I can't emphasize this enough, really, is the fire safety certification, the building and planning requirements, all of those, they've always been in existence. It is an assurance that those premises are safe and suitable for use as early years services, and Mike has gone through all the requirements and the options available to people in relation to that. For people who are taking over new services, we would say, just check and see where the re-registration status is with those services. Check and see about the completion of those, or the access back into the portal applications for those before, as part of your undertakings, really, for taking over the service. We have been given priority to the school age applications. As I said, currently the cyber attack has caused delays for us in relation to that. And this time of the year is particularly busy with new services that wish to open as well for September, or services who wish to make changes to their provision for September. So our focus very much has been on that at the time, for the time being. But we will be going back to reassessing the submissions that have come in. Another thing that we have noticed as well is that I know I've spoken to some people who have said that they have submitted their documentation, their fire and planning documentation, but it was actually submitted on the school age application as opposed to the early years preschool application. So just to check and see, if you are offering both and registering both a school age and re-registering the early years service, it's for the early years preschool service that you need to submit the fire and planning documentation. It's not required for the school age service. So I think that's it from me. If you have any questions, and we'll have a look at the questions that have come in on the chat there, we'll be very happy to address what we can in relation to those. And as I say, please contact the team if you have any queries at all in relation to your application, or if you're not sure where it's at or have any difficulty with it. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you, Jane. And thank you, Mike. Mike, I can see you've got your hand up there. Do you want to come in and say something before we go to some of the questions?
Yeah, thank you, Grant. And just to reiterate, I think Jane's provided quite a comprehensive commentary there, but just in relation to the point for any of you that might be considering taking over a service and taking over maybe the lease of a service or any of those kind of possibilities. As Jane said, I think it would be really crucially important. We've seen some examples of where people are attempting to take over a service, but have not checked the re-registration submission kind of requirements. If you take over a service, you will take over any liability that kind of comes with that service, and you will be responsible for the completion of the process. So we just would advise people, just when you're talking with the outgoing provider, to ensure that they give you access to their application and they can confirm for you what is submitted and what is outstanding, so that before you commit to a kind of a huge commitment, either maybe financially or just in terms of just workload, as to what you're kind of letting your, kind of signing up for, and what you're letting yourself in for in respect of that application. It is really important that as part of any due diligence or contract or any contract of undertakings, that you would address, the resubmission issues, and particularly in relation to fire and planning. I just, I know you know that, but just wanted to kind of reiterate that we have seen some examples where that's kind of gone very wrong, and people have been at a loss of a lot of time and commitment, and sometimes finances in that instance. Thanks, Grant. Just wanted to come in on that.
Thank you, Mike. That's helpful too. Okay, we'll go to some of the questions. There's a few questions around the status of applications, and I think this is something to do with the portal. So there's a question about what does complete mean and what does accepted mean? And then there's another one that says my application says receipt confirmed. What's meant by that? And then there's a third one in relation to that, When you've completed requirements on the portal, can you tell me the meaning of the status such as confirmed, complete, or accepted? If someone's application says complete, does this mean it's approved? So it's just around those different statuses that people get.
Okay, and so the application, when it's submitted on the portal, you mentioned it there, Grant, that it will indicate to you that your application has been received by ourselves. In relation to a complete application means that the application is closed from our end, that all issues have been dealt with and all of the documents have been submitted. I will have to come back to you, and we will do a summary in relation to the questions here, and we'll make them available. And I'll come back to you in relation to the accepted status on the portal. And the reason being is that I know that we changed some of those statuses over time to make them more relevant to the service. So we will put that information back up on the with this webinar.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Yes, we will do that. We'll put together a summary of some of the questions and the responses from later on, as Jane says. Quick one, who can supply the affidavit?
So the affidavit can be supplied by the Commissioner of Oaths or by a practicing solicitor.
Lovely, thank you. I think you might have covered this, but will the documents already submitted for after school suffice for the early years re-registration as they operate from the same building?
And the answer to that is the policies for your after school or school age service will be different to the policies for your preschool service. So you will have separate policies for both, so they'll need to be uploaded. The fire and planning documentation isn't required for the registration of the school age service, but it is required for the registration of the early years preschool service. The Garda vetting, the same documents would be submitted on both applications in relation to that.
Thanks, Jane. If we've already submitted policies such as infection control and they were deemed to be fine, do we need to resubmit newer versions referencing COVID-related controls?
For the purpose of the re-registration, no, you don't. The re-registration policies that were submitted will be assessed on inspection by the inspectors as they visit your premises. If this, and I think maybe related to school age application, the policies for the school age application that have currently not been registered must be up to date and give reference to the controls in place in relation to COVID-19.
Thank you, that's great. Will we have to submit all the same documents again in 2022? I know we referenced this a little bit as well.
Yes, no. The answer to that is no in 2022, and probably from September of next year, we will be looking at the re-registration process again. And as I say, it's ongoing. The documents that are being submitted are a declaration form, a current insurance certification, and current Garda vetting in relation to the registered provider of the services. So it's a much more streamlined process, and it is through the portal, but it is very much a streamlined process, so it'll be much easier for people to achieve.
Thanks, Jane. Mike, did you want to come in there, or are you okay?
Yeah, just really, just to, again, to kind of add, I mean, it's true, really, essentially, that can, for that streamlined process to be very successful, we have to complete this one. So, and get in all the documentation kind of this time. The only time that you might be asked to submit additional documentation is that if there's been any substantial changes made between the last registration and this kind of registration. But however, what we will be aiming to do is advise anybody who might be in that position to essentially make the changes through the change of circumstances process and not through the re-registration kind of process. And that would make it much simpler, and that would make the process of kind of managing any new information. We would be asking that would happen in advance before the re-registration application is made. So it should be very smooth, very quick, and kind of all the hard work of getting these applications across the line will pay dividend kind of going forward, if you like, in terms of process.
Thank you. A few questions here are related to planning documents. What are the planning documentation required for a service operating in a sports club where the planning documents doesn't specifically mention childcare, and these documents will not be changed? Quite sure about that, but it's basically about the planning documents in a sports club where it doesn't specifically mention childcare. It needs to specifically mention childcare, doesn't it?
Do you want me to take that one, Jane? Or...
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so we have a lot of kind of multi-use buildings, kind of, you know, like community centres and sports halls and various things like that. And in general kind of terms, like where something like that, so maybe it's an older building where the documentation isn't going to be changed, really essentially what we just ask you to do is contact your local authority and see is there any prohibition on the operation of an earlier service. And if they can confirm that there's no prohibition, then you can just submit the evidence of that with that document, and that will suffice. Always really what we say to people in these kind of instances is do not make assumptions. So for example, in relation to planning, we have seen lots of examples where early year settings have been operating in primary school, kind of in the environments of a primary school. And we have seen quite inconsistencies kind of in relation to kind of local authorities' attitude to that. In some instances, local authority will not seek any additional planning. In other instances, they will, but there seems to be a consistent view of the local authorities that if the early year service is catering for children who are sleeping, so like full day care services or part-time services where children are sleeping, they will not view it as a place of education, and therefore they are likely to look for additional kind of planning, in respect of that. So, again, we go back to that point of early engagement with the local authority and just kind of ask the question, and they're usually quite helpful in trying to kind of resolve it.
Thanks, Mike. That's very clear. And a couple more on planning documents. What planning documents are required for an ECHE-only service, and are these different to part-time services?
Yeah, so I suppose, sorry, Mike, to answer that, I think, and Mike has probably covered it already, really, is that the local authority are the ones who will determine what documents are required in relation to the type of service that you're offering. What we have found, particularly in sessional services that are operating within school premises, that the planning for the schools very often cover the operation of the sessional service also, as it's recognised as educational purposes. Where the planning, where the part-time service or a full day care service operates within a school, this is often back to planning to determine if the local authority to determine whether further planning is required, because it falls within the requirement of care as opposed to education once you move from the sessional service. So I think that might cover that, but ultimately it's the local authority that we would suggest that you go back to determine what are your requirements in relation to planning.
Thanks, Jane. We're just getting a little bit of feedback again with a couple of mics on there. So, and one more about planning. Why are fire and planning documents not required for school age care if the school age care is in a separate building from the early learning care centre?
Do
Okay,
you want to take that one, Jane? Sorry. I might just take that one quickly. I mean, essentially, really, the regulation kind of framework. Okay, so if I'm very specific about it, the regulations in relation to kind of school age currently only cover registration kind of requirements, and there is an intention, if you like, going forward to introduce more expanded regulations for kind of care and welfare. For school age. I cannot tell you when that'll be, guys. I don't, we understand that the Department of Children are going to shortly commence working on those. To say that it's not required kind of for a school age setting is not correct. The local authority, I think would absolutely say it is required for a kind of school age setting. We don't look for them kind of under registration currently, because under the registration requirements, there is no safety regulation that's kind of set out there yet, and that's expected. So what we're saying to everybody is operate as if they are required, because we would expect they are required by the local authorities, but we would expect in the next set of regulations that it will be included. So if you can deal with that now, probably is good to be in advance of that, but we would expect that expansive, comprehensive safety regulations will be introduced for school age settings.
Thanks, Mike. That's very clear too. Okay, there's just 3 more questions. So who can confirm the board of directors can you confirm that the board of directors don't need Garda vetting? Slightly different question about Garda vetting.
Yeah, so the question there is who can confirm, and the registered provider.
So of course, yeah.
Yes, yeah, the registered provider can confirm if the board of directors have access to children or not. So if any members of the board or if any of the directors have access to children within the service, then Garda vetting will be required for those. In relation to the portal application, what I would suggest is that you maybe put it onto one document stating that if there are no directors or board members accessing children in the service, put it onto a document and state that that's why there is no vetting submitted, is because there are no board members who have access to children in the service. So that can come from the registered provider, because ultimately it's the registered provider is responsible for ensuring that anybody in the service who accesses children is suitably and appropriately vetted in the first instance.
Thanks again, Jane. Go on, Mike, do you want to come back in there?
Yes, please. Just to add to that kind of point there, in general, however, everything Jane has said is absolutely correct. We do expect, however, that the registered provider, if they're the chair of a board, would have access to the premises when children are there to satisfy themselves that the service is run well, and should be acting as an agent of kind of quality. So we would be surprised if we saw nobody whatsoever with access to children. At least one person should have a role of quality assurance who from the board that's checking that the service is run well, and they should be doing that when the children are present in the service. They will be Garda vetted. We have extensive kind of communications and engagement with the Garda vetting department kind of in relation to that in Garda Síochána, and they're in agreement with that kind of principle. So we have guidance issued on that, and it's kind of on our regulatory notice kind of part of the website, and it is kind of covered on the re-reg kind of information as well for you, just if you're interested in reading that. Thanks.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions to finish off. So will an affidavit be accepted where a business is sold and not taken over as a new business?
The second bit is a bit confusing. That it was sold and then not taking over as a new business. I'm not sure what the person means by that.
Yeah, Michelle, I don't know if you want to just clarify that just in the chat there. It's probably easiest if you want to add anything to that to sort of so we can get our heads around it. And while you're doing that, if you have an opportunity to do so, if we go to the final question here, it's quite specific, but I think it's relevant generally. I've uploaded all my documentation and have been sorry. Could you turn your mics off? Apologies, Mike and Jane. I've uploaded all my documentation, have been emailed that my registration will be issued in due course. In the meantime, my planning permission is out of date and I've had to reapply for planning. Will I have to upload this new planning permission, or will I wait until 2022 to upload with updated policies? I don't know if that might be a bit too specific, but generally, do you want to come in on that?
So if the planning was in date at the time of the application being assessed and completed, that planning will be absolutely sufficient because it was, and the application closed out. If the application was still open and during that time that the planning had expired, well, then we would be asking you to upload the new planning onto the portal with that application. So no, and that can happen quite a bit. We have seen where there are porta cabins in place with 5-year planning granted for those, and that 5 years may be expired after your re-registration process. So no, it's absolutely perfect that you went and sought planning again, or to extend it with your local authority. But if your re-registration application was complete, you don't need to submit the new planning at this point in time.
Thanks, Jane. That's clear too. Thank you very much. And Michelle's come back. Thank you for coming back, Michelle. So basically, taking over a current POBL number. So I think, Mike, basically, this question is, will an affidavit be accepted where a business is sold and the existing business is taken over by somebody else, but not as a new business because it's taking over the existing POBL number? So that I guess that makes it a going concern in that context, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does make it a going concern. I would advise against it, and the reason I would advise against it is that in general kind of terms, that if it came to enforcement by the local authorities don't accept, usually in our experience and our knowledge, a transfer. An affidavit only applies into a sitting service operated by the same person for 7 years. I think it would be highly, kind of risky to take over a service kind of based on an affidavit kind of thereafter. Now, that being said, there wouldn't be anything to prevent you from taking that, but I wouldn't unless you check that first with your local authority, because the issue in respect of the affidavit is usually quite strict, that it applies quite strictly to same person for a period of 7 years and is still operational. That's the statute of limitation, what the statute of limitation says and how it's applied. So if it's transferred to somebody else, it would null and void it.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And there's just a couple more that have come in again in relating to planning requirements. What planning requirements are required for a building built prior to 1991? Is an affidavit from a solicitor of early years operation sufficient?
Yes, if there has been no changes to the building. If it's been operational, kind of, in terms of, kind of since pre-1991, for sure it's well outside the 7-year statute of limitations, and we see lots of that in relation to older services. However, the only exception is that if the building is a listed building, so if the building was deemed from, kind of pre-1991 or has the status of a listed kind of building, no changes can be made to it, and no changes can be made in any way, shape or form to its use. So if it was being used for something other than what it was listed for, then irrespective of when it was kind of operational, there could be a problem there. But other than that, all things being equal, yes, an affidavit would be fine in that instance.
Okay, there's another one that is quite specific about a service, but again, I'll put it to you and we'll see. So if a fire risk assessment has been carried out due to a building being built in 1895, I think that's probably meant to be 1895, and a note is best practice should have a fire certificate as a trivial comment, and the primary school where we are based are unwilling to pay for the full building to have a fire certificate, what can we do? Does that make sense?
So if I understood it kind of correctly, the kind of question really amounts to, is the person who carried out the fire risk assessment stating that it needs a fire certificate or not, kind of definitively? If there is any doubt about it, I would be checking with the fire authorities as to whether that's the case. In general, I would think it wouldn't be, because it's well outside the 5-year kind of period. And unless there was substantial kind of changes, and don't quote me on this because I'm not an absolute expert in this kind of area, but from what we understand, what we are seeing with older premises is that fire risk assessments, do suffice. A fire risk assessment will suffice in that instance. But if the architect or the competent person was suggesting that it didn't need a fire risk assessment, what I would certainly be doing is finding out the rationale for that as to why they're suggesting that it does need a fire risk assessment. And then you would be armed with sufficient information to check that out against what the local authorities would be saying in respect to it.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Okay, I think we're coming up to 7:30, so I think we'll bring it to a conclusion there. Thank you, Mike and Jane, and thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate you spending the time to join with us this evening and for sticking with us. Sorry, Mike, do you mind turning your mic again? Apologies, it's buzzing in my ear. So yeah, just thank you again. We will, as we've said, we will make sure that this recording is available on the website. We will make sure the slides are available on the website, and we will put together a summary pack of some of the questions and the responses to them. And we'll make all of those available on our website. And when we've done so, we'll let people know. So I think that concludes the evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. We very much hope it's been useful, and we hope to see you again at some point, possibly some point in the not too near future, actually, in the flesh rather than virtually. But thank you again.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Bye, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us.